Hello? Hello?
Hello, sir.
Hi.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we'll be just starting the session in about 8 to 9 minutes.
Okay. Okay, is there anything I have to do to prepare, or should I just wait to hear from you?
So we'll just request you to wait for 8 minutes. We'll
Okay.
just begin the session. Yeah.
Okay, fine.
Thanks, Niharika, and
Hi.
good evening, Professor Richard Salomon. Very nice to see you. Well, we start our lectures only at 9:30, so we will start at 9:30 as usual. And Niharika, my colleague, is making you a co-host so that you can share your file. That's
Okay.
what I think we discussed, and it should not be a problem. Would you have any question for us?
No, I just wanted to check in a little early to make sure everything was working, but it seems to be fine. So, all right, I'll just wait.
Yeah, so Niharika has you the co-host, and I think the sharing of the file should not be a problem from your side.
Okay.
All right. So we will see you again in about 10 minutes. Thanks for being there.
Okay, I'm going to take a little break then.
Thank you.
I'll be back soon.
A very good morning to everyone and good evening in different time zones, I believe. A very warm welcome to everyone for our 8th lecture. I'll request Professor Sangeeta Menon,
Okay, I think, thank you, Niharika. I think there's some internet issues from your side, but I would pretend that I have heard all that which you are supposed to say. So thank you, Niharika. And namaste to all of you. Namaste, Professor Madhav Deshpande. Namaste, Professor Richard Salomon. To just begin with this series, which started in Jan, with Professor Madhav Deshpande's 5 lectures. This lecture series titled Sanskrit Language and Its Traditions, A Journey Through Its History and Contemporaneity. We started actually on 20th January, and we have finished a very significant number of lectures. And today is the 8th lecture by Professor Richard Salomon. And since you are present, I wanted to once again reiterate that that we are so happy and so grateful to you for your presence, Professor Richard, and for making it possible for this series and sharing your insights and knowledge with us. And I'm equally thankful to Professor Madhav Deshpande for connecting you with us and suggesting your name for this lecture. If had it not been for him, perhaps we would not have had the opportunity to listen to you. So with that very brief opening remarks, may I request Meera Kumar Menon to have the invocation for the day sung. But before I request her, Meera is my student. She is a doctoral scholar at NIAS. And she does her work on a very fascinating topic, which is to look at the Mantravada traditions in Kerala, a state which both she and I belong, but more than that, a state which is very interesting for its cultural plurality and also interest in different healing traditions. So Meera focuses on the Nambudiri Illams. But I won't explain the detail, but of course you can ask me or Meera later. So she focuses on the Nambudiri Illams and documents the practices of healing. And because of her background in psychology and literature, she's also able to involve a method which is both ethnographic and thematic in nature. So it's a very rich qualitative study. And she's also a singer. So with that brief introduction to Meera Menon, may I request for the most sacred invocation for the day. Thank you, Meera. And I'm sure you will explain what you will be singing today as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those beautiful words, ma'am. It's very humbling. And today I'll be singing a few lines in Malayalam and a few lines in Sanskrit as well. So the Malayalam song means that playing the music on the strings of our...
Meera, you're muted. Yeah, Meera, I think we lost in 1 minute. Last 1 minute, you may want to.
So I will be singing a Malayalam song and a few verses in Sanskrit as well, with joining the spirit of the lecture today. So the lines in Malayalam means playing the music of love on the strings of our heart and filling the world with inherent goodness. Let us praise the Creator who resides within us. May the songs we sing be praises to Him. May the steps we take be pleasant and graceful. May our little hearts be heavenly abodes and the kisses of our mothers be the heavenly nectar Amrit. And may we realize that all that is living and non-living are our teacher's blessings. And the verse from Sanskrit, the first one, is from Hemachandra's Kavyanushasana. which says of natural flowing sweet words elucidating the nature of reality, transforming into every language, so is the speech of Jaina, and we have recourse to it. The second verse is from Jain canonical literature, which says, gods, evolved humans, foresters, and animals heard the Lord's sermon in their own respective languages. And here we are from our multi-cultures, all gathered here to listen to a lecture, probably understanding them in our own languages. So, over to this. Hridaya raga tandri meeti sneha geetame kim nanma bhuvil taliridunna varname kiyum nammil vaazhum aadinamam innu vaarthidam hridaya raga tandri meeti ഞങ്ങൾ പാടുമീ പദങ്ങൾ സ്നേഹഗീതമാകവേ ചുവടുവയ്ക്കുമീ പദങ്ങൾ നൃത്തലോലമാകവേ കുഞ്ഞു വീടിൻ ഉൾത്തടങ്ങൾ സ്വർഗമാകവേ അമ്മ നൽകും ഉമ്മ പോലും അമൃതമാകവേ പൂർണ്ണമീ ചരാചരങ്ങൾ ഗുരുവരങ്ങളാകവേ ഹൃദയരാഗ തന്ത്രി മീട്ടി അക്രതൃസ്വാദുപദാം പരമാർത്ഥാഭിദായിനി സർവഭാഷാ പരിണതാം ജനിം വാചമുപാസ്മഹേ ദേവദേവീം നരാനാരീം ശാബരശ്ച ബിശാബരീം തിര്യജോഭിതൈരശ്ചിം മേനിരേ ഭഗവദ്ഗീരം.
Thank you so much, Meera, for that beautiful invocation song, and I think it is so befitting for today's lecture. So, without much ado, to all the audience out there, today's lecture is by Professor Richard Salomon, and the title of his lecture is Indian Inscriptions, Prakrit, Sanskrit, and Everything Between, the Grand Paradox of Indian Epigraphy. By the way, the familiar face is absent today because Preet has gone to Vadodara for a particular event which it was impossible for him to avoid. So that's why you're missing the familiar face today, and I have taken up his role. Before I request Professor Richard Salomon, may I briefly introduce him. Professor Richard Salomon took his PhD from University of Pennsylvania in 1975, and is currently the Emeritus Professor of Asian Languages and Literature, Sanskrit, and he is the William P. and Ruth Gerberding University Professor Emeritus at the University of Washington, Seattle. Professor Salomon has taught at the University of Washington since 1978, and he continues to teach there on a post-retirement part-time basis. He is the former president of the International Association of Buddhist Studies and of the American Oriental Society. Since 1996, he has been the director of the University of Washington's Early Buddhist Manuscripts Project, leading the ongoing international project of editing, translating, and publishing the earliest surviving Buddhist manuscripts. Professor Salomon's specialties include Sanskrit language and literature, Indian Buddhist literature and textual studies, Indian epigraphy, paleography, early Indian history, Gandhari language and Gandharan studies, and the world history of writing. He has published 6 books and over 140 scholarly articles in these fields, including Indian epigraphy and several other books. So you can imagine how lucky we are today to listen to Professor Richard Salomon. But before inviting him, may I know if Professor Madhav Deshpande would have a few lines to add about the series of this lecture or why we are all sitting here today, Professor Madhav?
Well, thank you so much, Rich. It has been a long time that I have seen you in person, but Richard and I graduated from the same University of Pennsylvania, though he joined it almost after I finished my PhD there. But we have known each other on a lifelong basis. I'm extremely happy that you accepted our invitation, and we are so lucky so that we will listen to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhavji. Thank you. So may I now invite Professor Richard Salomon for his lecture. And I think you would like to share the file. So you may please go ahead, sir. Or if you wish to say something in the beginning, we will leave it to you. And we will leave it to you how you want to organize your lecture.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to just say a few words first, and
Yes,
then
sir.
I'll do the screen sharing. So first, I wanted to thank everybody, including especially Madhav, for inviting me to participate. I'm happy to be here. I wish I was in India with you, but that is not possible nowadays, but I hope that will become possible pretty soon. My talk today actually follows on Madhav's, I think it was Madhav's last lecture on vernacular Sanskrit. Is that the 5th lecture, I believe. And he introduced several of the themes that I'm going to be talking about, but I'll be going into more detail about the manifestations of vernacular Sanskrit. As Madhav said, we've traveled similar paths. I like to think we've traveled together. Actually, I've been following in his footsteps since he's a little bit my senior, but our interests and our point of view, I think, on Sanskrit and Sanskritic studies have been quite similar all along. So I follow up on his beginning of all these subjects. So that's just a little bit of introduction. So now I'm going to press share screen and hope that it works. Where is my presentation? Maybe it's here. Yes. So now I just have to put it on the presentation mode. So I just want to check, is everybody seeing the title of my lecture at the top?
Yes, sir. We are seeing it clearly.
Okay, good. So I'm sorry, I don't have great faith in technology. I'm not very capable, and I get a little anxious about it, and then I'm happily surprised when it works. But sometimes. I just wanted to point out about the title of my presentation, and I called it Prakrit Sanskrit and Everything in Between. I wonder if anyone thought it was a little unusual, because usually people will say Sanskrit and Prakrit rather than Prakrit and Sanskrit. But I did that on purpose and trying to make a point. And my point is that what is called the grand paradox, which is the fact, sometimes considered strange or problematic, that all of the earliest surviving documents in Indian languages, and by that I mean surviving documents, actual physical remains, not transmitted text, but actual texts physically attested, all of them are in Prakrit, and it's not until considerably later that that documents in Sanskrit, that is inscriptions in Sanskrit, begin to appear. And of course, everyone knows that in terms of linguistic history, Sanskrit precedes Prakrit, but in terms of actual surviving documents, Prakrit precedes Sanskrit. So that is what is called, and I've used the title, the expression in my title, the grand paradox of Indian epigraphy. And that's the subtitle for the first part. I'll be speaking in 4 parts today. The first part is talking about the grand linguistic paradox, as it's called. And here I've given you, this is somewhat randomly, it was just an example of the kind of inscriptions that I'll be talking about, a very nicely inscribed introductory portion, date, the year 4 of the King Kanishka on a statue from Mathura, which is the area and period that I'll be focusing on. The French, famous French Sanskrit scholar Louis Reynaud pointed out this peculiar apparent paradox that Prakrit seems to precede Sanskrit in Indian documents, in surviving documents, and he called it the great paradox, or the grand paradox of in India's grand linguistic paradox. But of course, it only seems to be a paradox, and I'll try to explain, make sense of it all as I go through my presentation this afternoon, morning, whatever it is where you are. I guess it's morning for most of you. So the next image I'd like to show is this wonderful rock in Junagadh in Gujarat, which some of you may recognize, and this is how it looked when it was first discovered in 1869. I call it the most important rock in Indian history because, as some of you may remember, it contains not just one and not just 2, but 3 very important inscriptions which kind of summarize the linguistic history of Indian epigraphy. So I begin with that. And the first of the 3 inscriptions on this rock is, of course, something that will be familiar to everyone, the Ashokan rock edicts. It's got a complete set, and the ones that we see in this image from the front of the rock as number 9, 10, 11, and 12 in beautiful, clearly preserved, beautifully written early Mauryan period Brahmi. The second inscription on the same rock, right next to it, the Ashokan inscription is over here on the right side, and then over here we have the Sanskrit inscription of King Rudra II, dating from about 150 CE, so that's 400 years later than the inscription of Ashoka. And this inscription is in more or less pure classical Sanskrit. So we see the transition literally before our eyes on this rock. We see the transition from Prakrit to Sanskrit. And then we see that over here, not very clearly, but the Sanskrit tradition continues, and there's an inscription by the Gupta king, the late Gupta king, Skandagupta, inscription dated from around the end of the 4th century AD. So I'll be talking about all of these items again later on.
Excuse me, Professor.
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you please make the PPT into a full screen? We are partially seeing your slides.
This should be full screen. Let me stop sharing. And when you say partially, which part? What were you seeing?
I'm actually seeing your slide and also the next slide, the preview of the next slide.
Okay. I see what the problem is. I'm using 2 screens, and it's probably showing my small screen. So let me see if I can fix that.
It's not a big issue. We only just wanted to alert you in case you had not noticed it, but then absolutely fine. We don't want to put you into any trouble.
Well,
It's fine.
no, I want to be right. So let me try again. Are you seeing, did that change?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so now you're just seeing the current slide, is that correct?
Thank
Okay,
you, sir.
good. Thank you. Thank you for telling me that. I was looking at the wrong screen, I think. So this was all more or less introductory to show you examples of the material that I'll be talking about. And now I'll proceed with my main topic, which is trying to explain this so-called grand paradox, whereby it seems like the child appears before the mother, Prakrit appearing before Sanskrit. And I'll try to make some sense of that and try to explain how the linguistic history really worked, and really much more, considerably more complicated than it seems on the surface. So it's not a paradox, it's just a manifestation of a more complex situation as follows. So that all by way of just general introduction. And now part two, outlining the history of Sanskrit and Prakrit in Indian epigraphy. And each of these sections, I show you an example inscription. The inscriptions are not particularly relevant to the topic, to the particular part of my lecture, just to give people some images of interesting or important or typical inscriptions. So here's an example of an inscription from the far northwest in the Grojdi script here at the bottom. From Swat Valley in Pakistan, and the text is in Gandhari Prakrit, but the sense of it will be pretty obvious to everyone, I think. It just says Padani, the Sanskrit Padao. It would be the feet, the footprints of Buddha Shakyamuni. And it's a famous inscription because the Chinese pilgrims who came to India in the 6th and 7th century, around 7th and 8th century, came and actually described something very similar to this, and probably saw this exact inscription. But that's just a sideline, not relevant to my main point. So now just a little historical survey. So the earliest definitely datable inscriptions of the historical period. And when I say of the historical period, I'm saying, not talking about Harappan Indus Valley culture writing. That's a completely different topic that's presumably or probably not relevant to what I'm talking about. So I say in the historical period, I say that the earliest inscriptions or the earliest datable inscriptions are those of Ashoka, his rock edicts, as we saw before, and his pillar edicts, as you have here, as you see here. This is right there in Delhi. Some of you can easily go and see it. I visited last time I was in Delhi. And the rock edicts, as we saw earlier, the famous rock of Junagadh. And these inscriptions were recorded by Ashoka in Prakrit in 3 different dialects of Prakrit, depending on where they were inscribed, among other factors. And so that helps us, explains really half of the paradox right then and there. If the question, the problem raised by the paradox is, why does Indian epigraphy begin with Prakrit, which is linguistically later, rather than beginning with Sanskrit, which is linguistically earlier? Well, the answer is Ashoka made a decision. He was the first king, as far as we know, and probably at all, the first king who inscribed royal proclamations on permanent surfaces, first one to do that in India. And he chose Prakrits for reasons which he doesn't explicitly explain, but they're pretty easy to guess. And if you know Ashoka and know what his unique worldview is, and you know what his inscriptions talk about, it's clear that he wanted to reach and communicate with and express himself to his people at all levels, not just the elite, but the ordinary and lower classes of people. So what better way to do that than with Prakrit, and particularly with using the various local dialects of Prakrit. So that explains why the first inscriptions are in Prakrit, a conscious decision, no doubt, by Ashoka. So I have a little footnote to what I just said, because this is an issue that often comes up. And I said, I chose my words a little carefully. I said the earliest definitely datable inscriptions are those of Ashoka. I didn't say the earliest inscriptions of the historical period, because there are several gray areas there. There are some inscriptions also in Prakrit, which some people think are earlier than Ashoka. Some say contemporary with Ashoka or even later. And there are also inscriptions in Tamil or in old Dravidian languages, which have been argued to be pre-Ashokan. But these are not particularly relevant to my issue here. So for a practical way of looking at it, we can just say that the Ashokan inscriptions are effectively the earliest relevant documents. So starting with that, of course, Ashokan, we're talking about, I just say middle of the 3rd century before BC or BCE, for a convenient approximate date. And after that time, from the time of Ashoka, for at least 2 centuries, until sometime in approximately the middle or the later part of the first century BC, the inscriptions, all inscriptions are in Prakrit of some form or other. And many of the inscriptions are in Brahmi script, as we see here, or variations, developments of the script. Others, as you may know, inscriptions from the Northwest are in Kharoshthi script. I showed you an example of that earlier, excuse me. But regardless, they're all in Prakrit language, different dialects of Prakrit, but that doesn't matter too much for our purposes. So I just have 1 or 2 examples. This is one of the many inscriptions from the Buddhist stupa at Barhut, which is in Madhya Pradesh, in eastern MP. And I'm sure people are familiar with these beautiful sculptures, which you can see in the Indian Museum in Calcutta and some other places in Varanasi and some other museums in India and elsewhere. And they have these beautiful scenes. And also, what to me is my favorite part is inscriptions either recording the donations or describing the depicted scenes, which is, by the way, something very rare in early Indian art, to have descriptive labels. And why Buddhists did it at Barhut but not at Sanchi and other places is a bit of a mystery. But that's not really my topic. So this is the scene which is famous in early Buddhist tradition. Anathapindika, who was the great wealthy lay patron of the Buddha, and he bought this place called Jetavana in Shravasti, and that became the first vihara, or residence of the Buddhist community. And this shows the scene. Maybe some people remember the story that the price of this land that Anathapindika wants to buy for the Buddha, the owner, Prince Jeta, the price, he says, is that you have to fill it, the whole ground, with kahapanas, that is karshapanas, the ancient coins. And Anathapindika was very wealthy and said, okay, I'll do it. And so here people bringing cartloads, servants, workers bring cartloads of coins and laying them all out until they cover the whole ground. And when they do that, it becomes the property of Anathapindika, and then he donates it to the Buddhist Sangha. And this is the inscription that I've marked down here, and it's very Prakrit, as you can see, Jetavana Anathapindiko Deti, which corresponds to Sanskrit Dadati, Koti Santatena which corresponds to Sanskrit. Koti is the same. Samskritena, Samskrita, that is a layer. A layer, and it means of Karshapanas. It doesn't say that because everybody knows the story. And Keta corresponds to Sanskrit Kritva, not Kritva, but Kritva, having bought after buying it for a layer of gold. So this is just a nice sample of a typical Prakrit inscription. The dating of these inscriptions is a little bit controversial. Some people say 2nd century, some people say early 1st century, BC, but it doesn't matter for our purposes, somewhere in that pre-Sanskrit area period. So that's an example of what I call a mainland India Prakrit inscription. And then I wanted to give one example of the inscriptions from the far northwest, which are very numerous in this and succeeding periods. So these are inscriptions in, excuse me, in Kharosthi script, and the language is Prakrit, but it's the peculiar local vernacular of the Northwest, what we nowadays call Gandhari Prakrit. So this is the base, it's the square base of a model stupa. The rest of the stupa has not survived. And all around it, these are two of the 4 square sides, the A and B, and then there's sides C and D. We don't see them here. And then this is a dedicatory inscription, gives the date corresponding to a date in the late 2nd century, somewhat later than what we saw before. And it records the name of the donor and the date. And it also includes what in Sanskrit is called Pratitya Samutpada, or in Pali, Pratitya Samutpada, the basic formula of metaphysics, statement of basic metaphysics of Buddhist tradition. So this is this is the line here that I've outlined in red, and this is the Gandhari, the transcription of the Gandhari text, and this is the Sanskrit equivalent of it. So you can see avidya for avidya, it's familiar, pratyaga for pratyayaha, and so forth. So those are just examples of the kind of materials that we see in the Prakrit period of Indian epigraphy. That is the period between about the middle of the 3rd and the middle of the 1st century BC, when everything is in Prakrit. And then things begin to change, but I would say they only begin to change. They don't change all of a sudden. There's a period, which I'll be discussing in some detail, period of several centuries when there's this gradual transition from Prakrit to Sanskrit, and in a particular and slightly unusual way that I intend to talk about in some detail. So this is what may be the oldest inscription in Sanskrit, approximately sometime in the 1st century BC. I say it may be the oldest because there's one other inscription from Yoja, which seems to be approximately contemporary. We don't have actual dates, so all of these are approximate dates, circa approximately, because the inscriptions are not dated, and they do refer to kings. There's a king in this one called Sarvatata, but these kings are absolutely unknown from any other sources. So we don't have any direct way to date these inscriptions. The way we do it is by the notoriously inaccurate technique of paleographic estimation. That is to say, we compare the shapes and developmental stage of the letters in this inscription with other inscriptions for which we do have dates, and then we kind of make a guess within that range, but it's a very imprecise method. I always add a plus or minus 50 years to those kind of dates. But anyway, I think everyone's pretty much agreed that this inscription and the other early Sanskrit inscription from Yoja come from probably sometime in the 1st century BC. So this is from a place near Chittorgarh in Rajasthan. It's an inscription which unusually is recorded in 4 versions, in 4 copies, inscribed on 4 different stones, which are found at 2 villages, Gosundi and Hatibara, near Chittorgarh. And the topic of the inscription is the dedication by this king Sarvapata, who claims to be an Ashwamedha Yajin. So he claims to be an important king, but we have no other record of him in history. So who knows what the truth was. And this is the topic is what I've said here. It's dedicating a Puja Shila Prakara, which I didn't translate that because it's hard to translate, but it's something like a stone wall for puja. It's probably, there might have been some sort of shrine and a stone wall around it, which people would circumambulate and do their puja. And this puja was for, and I marked the words here, Sankarshana Vasudevabhyam. These words, that is, say, for Krishna and Balarama. So this is an important document in the history of the Hindu religion, development of the worship of Krishna and Balarama. But for our purposes, talking about the linguistic features, and the important thing is that it's in perfect Sanskrit or almost perfect Sanskrit. Actually, there's a defect here. This is Bhagavabhyam, some version of the Vasudevabhyam. It says Bhagavabhyam. It doesn't say Bhagavadbhyam, which it should. It says Bhagavabhyam. So some people say it's not really Sanskrit. It's a little bit of Prakrit mixed in. Other people say it's just a scribal error. So that's a matter of opinion. But we see at least something is happening now in the 1st century BC. There's that line I was referring to. But what didn't happen, I want to emphasize, it's not like all of a sudden 1st century BC, stop Prakrit, start Sanskrit. On the contrary, there was a transitional period, and that transitional period lasted at least 3 or maybe 4 centuries, in which there was a gradual shift. And at this period, 1st century BC, the great majority of inscriptions are still in Prakrit, and Sanskrit starts showing up, and gradually the weight shifts and Sanskrit starts becoming more common and Prakrit less common. And eventually by, let's say, the 4th century AD, that is by the early Gupta Empire, Sanskrit completely takes over Prakrit, and there are no more Prakrit inscriptions, with a few exceptions in a Jain context, and otherwise we'll get some, but essentially Sanskrit has taken over as Prakrit, as the main language of epigraphy. But even that is not the truth. That is still simplified, because it's not that first there were more Prakrit inscriptions and gradually there were more Sanskrit. There was something else in between, and in between there was a mixed language, which was neither exactly Sanskrit nor exactly Prakrit. So the mixed dialect, or epigraphical hybrid Sanskrit, or other terms, and I'll talk about the terminology a little bit later on. But this is actually, I'm now coming to my main topic, which is the nature of and explanation of and position of this mixed language of Indian inscriptions. So first, I'd like to show you an example. And this I picked some more or less randomly as one of the representative examples of what this mixed dialect looks like. So this is an inscription, a Buddhist inscription, as many, but not all of these inscriptions are. A Buddhist inscription from Mathura. It's from probably the early Kushan period, maybe late 1st or into the 2nd century AD. And if you look at it, you might, if you look at it quickly, you might think it's Sanskrit, or you might think it's Prakrit. And if you look at it closer, you'll probably start wondering what it really is. So first word here, Bodhisattva. This thing on top is the O. So you say, okay, Bodhisattva, nominative pratama form. And then we have Saha. And then you say, wait a minute, something's wrong. It shouldn't be O, the Sandhi is wrong. It should be Bodhisattva before Saha. You say, okay, maybe scribe didn't know his Sandhi rules very well. But then you look at this, you know, Mata Pitihi, you say, oh, no, this can't be Sanskrit. It should be Mata Pitribhyam for with mother and father. It should be, you know, dual instrumental, Tritiya Vivachana, should be Mata Pitribhyam. So you think, okay, it's Prakrit. And then, sure, Upadhyayena, Sanskrit, it would be Upadhyayena. So you say, okay, now I understand, it's Prakrit. And then you say, see, Dharmakena. You say, wait a minute, it's Sanskrit, because Prakrit would be Dhammakena. And so on. And you go through and, well, I'll show you in a little more detail. So this is the same text that I showed you, just the basic transcription. This is the Sanskrit parts, okay? So Mata Pi, okay. The inflection is wrong. Upadhyayena for Upadhyaya, it's part of Sanskrit, Prakrit, this one, same as Sanskrit, and so forth. So then here I show you what the Prakrit pieces are. So Ihi is Prakrit, Upadhyaya, the Jha is Prakrit, and so forth. And here I've put it together, Sanskrit and Prakrit, and then finally I've given you the complete Sanskrit Chaya. So I'd like to look just a little more at these two words, Upadhyayena. Dharmakena, as I said, is same as Sanskrit. And it's not Prakrit. Upadhyaya is Prakrit. Sanskrit would be Upadhyaya. So the Dhya, as everyone knows, if you study Prakrit, Dhya becomes Jha. In Sanskrit, Dhya becomes Jha in Prakrit. And notice also that in Sanskrit, it's Upadhyaya. It's not Upadhyaya, it's Upadhyaya. But in Prakrit, because of what's called the law of Morai, it's called in Western terminology. I'm not sure what the Sanskrit word for that is. But because this Jha is really a double consonant, it's Jha. So and by the Prakrit rule, the preceding vowel before a double consonant is always short. If it's originally long, it gets shortened. So even there's a subtle change in the vowel there. In the Prakrit form, here we have Shri, Sanskrit Shri, with Swara Bhakti or epenthesis, another typical Prakrit form element, and so forth. So I hope this gives you a general idea of what what this mixed dialect really looks like. So let me go back for a minute. So this thing, I mean, people who are, and I imagine a lot of people are not familiar with reading these kinds of mixed documents in mixed dialect, that's sometimes Sanskrit, sometimes Prakrit, may look pretty strange. It may even look bizarre or wrong or even offensive. But I'm trying to make the point that there's some important historical linguistic information in this phenomenon. It's not just a barbarism, as some people, some scholars have, I think, wrongly dismissed it. So, you know, if you look at the earlier literature on this sort of material, you'll see a lot of different terms used to refer to this material. So I think of, for instance, the great epigraphist D.C. Sarkar, who I often try to emulate in my work. And he talked about these things in his famous anthology of Indian inscriptions, Select Inscriptions, wonderful book. And he called some of these inscriptions, sometimes he'd say, he described it as Prakrit influenced by Sanskrit, and sometimes he'd say Sanskrit influenced by Prakrit, depending on how, the amount, the relationship of Prakrit and Sanskrit varies in these different inscriptions. Other people call it just mixed dialect. Some people call it corrupt Sanskrit, which I don't like. I like to avoid these judgmental terms. And I was surprised. I looked this up. There's a very important book, you might be familiar with it, by the British Indologist Thomas Barrow, called The Sanskrit Language. It's an old book, but it's still very important. But I was a little surprised by what he said about this mixed dialect. He called it a mongrel language employed by those who wish to employ the superior Sanskrit language, but were unable to master its grammar. So he thinks it's just it's Sanskrit written by stupid people, by uneducated people. I think that's really wrong. I really object to his characterization. I think this material is so common and so prevalent for such a long period, for several centuries. I think it's expressing a linguistic reality. It's not just expressing a defective command of language. I think it's a linguistic reality that's worthy of consideration on its own terms, and that's what I intend to do with the rest of my time. By the way, I should check what time it is. I'm sorry, what time is it there? I'm losing track.
Well, here it is 10:15 a.m. You may
Okay.
take time as you would like to.
So it's 10:15 and you started at 9:30, is that right?
That's right, it's 45 minutes past.
So then I'm talking too much. I'll
Not
try
really.
it's a tendency. Okay, I'll try to go a little faster. So the name of this, the descriptive name of this mixed dialect, in 1978, a book was published by a Dutch Indologist named Dongsteeg. I think this was mentioned by Madhav in his talk. And the book was called Epigraphical Hybrid Sanskrit. And that's the term that we use now. And that's a good descriptive and neutral, non-judgmental term. Of course, many of you will recognize that he borrowed that term from the term Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit, which is a term invented by the American Indologist Franklin Edgerton, because they are essentially two manifestations of the same phenomenon, the same linguistic phenomenon, the development of mixed dialects. So that's a good term, and that's the one I use, and that others, I think everyone else uses now. There's surely no coincidence that these hybrid languages, the epigraphical and the hybrid, occurred at more or less the same time and more or less the same part of India. What we learn is that surely something significant was changing in the linguistic fabric of North India in about the early centuries of the Common Era. This hybrid dialect took on a life of an identity of its own during this period. So I turn now to my next topic, which is part 3, Sanskrit and Prakrit through the ages. So now I'm going to talk more broadly about how Sanskrit and Prakrit have related to each other and how that, in my opinion, or I'll try to explain how that determines and explains what happened in this development of mixed dialects. And again, I think back to Madhav's lecture on vernacular Sanskrit, where he showed how Sanskrit, even in modern times, is often affected by the native language or the mother tongue of the various people who are using Sanskrit. And basically, I'm talking about the same thing having happened in various times in antiquity and going back actually to very far in antiquity. So this is just another sample inscription, just for your amusement. This is the famous Lumbini inscription of Ashoka, where it says Hida Bhagavan Jateti. This is where, so that's how we know literally where the Buddha was born. So, yeah, turn the page. So talking about Prakrit and Sanskrit, the European ontologists prefer to talk about Middle Indo-Aryan rather than Prakrit, and they talk about Old Indo-Aryan rather than Sanskrit, or just MIA and OIA, or the abbreviations. Technically, that's in a certain sense more correct to use those terms, but as a matter of practical and familiarity, I'll use the more general terms, Prakrit and Sanskrit. I mean, everyone agrees that in a certain sense, Prakrit comes from Sanskrit. Sanskrit doesn't come from Prakrit. I'm not saying that, I'm not crazy. And we know that as basic linguistic fact. I mean, you can take more or less any word in Sanskrit, say karma, okay? In Sanskrit, you say karma, in Prakrit, you say kamma. Well, you can understand very easily, if you know basic historical linguistics, that the word karma can turn into kamma, a consonant group urma becomes geminated and becomes mama. That's an absolutely normal linguistic development that happens in many languages, in European languages as well. But you can't explain, you can't say kamma turns into karma. That is, there's no linguistic motivation for that change in that direction. That's just not how phonetic changes work in any language. Another example is in Sanskrit you say adya, in Prakrit you say ajja, and in Hindi you say aj. So adya becoming ajja is perfectly explainable. The ya palatalizes the da and turns it into a ja, and then you get the two consonants together become geminate ajja. It's perfectly natural. You cannot imagine the word ajja turning into adya. That's, again, unmotivated change. So, okay, in a linguistic sense, but not in a historical sense necessarily, in a linguistic sense, certainly Prakrit comes from Sanskrit. Everybody would agree with that. That is to say, Sanskrit comes before Prakrit. When I say comes before, I didn't say Sanskrit is older than Prakrit. I said Sanskrit comes before Prakrit. Prakrit comes from Sanskrit. But that's in terms of linguistic developments, not in terms of history, in terms of chronological time. So what's really going on? Well, as I said, the first material evidence of Sanskrit we have is not until the 1st century BC. So that proves nothing. The principle is absence proves nothing. No one would argue that Sanskrit only existed in the 1st century BC. I mean, everybody knows that, you know, the Vedic literature, the Rig Veda and all Vedic literature, and the Panini's Ashtadhyayi and the Mahabharata, or at least the predecessors of the Mahabharata, certainly are before the 1st century BC. They're far before. They're hundreds of years, thousands of years, some people would say many thousands of years before the 1st century BC. Exact dates, very difficult to pin down, but it doesn't matter. We don't need exact dates. And why we don't have earlier physical documentation of Sanskrit is pretty easy to explain. On the one hand, there was not the epigraphic tradition, the tradition of writing inscriptions, used Prakrit until 1st century, as I discussed, and whatever other written documents there might have been had no chance to survive in the monsoon climate. Organic materials and manuscripts on palm leaf and birch bark rarely last more than a few centuries. So there's a blank period, but there's a clear explanation. Sanskrit existed far, far before its first physical manifestations have survived. So, okay, Sanskrit in some shape or form, Vedic language, whatever you want to call it, goes back certainly into the 2nd millennium BC. Some people would say earlier than that. I don't care to argue that, it doesn't matter. It goes far back. all we need to say for my purposes. What about Prakrit? Well, the Prakrit inscriptions that I've been showing and talking about, particularly the Ashokan inscriptions, are the earliest documentary record of Prakrit. So how much farther back does Prakrit go, in fact, than that? Well, that's a little harder to say because we don't have clear, datable, really ancient literary remains of Prakrit as we do for the Sanskrit language. But there is, I'll just say, to begin the argument, there is good reason to think that Prakrit existed, was used long before it was first documented in the about the 3rd century BC. The evidence of this is linguistic rather than textual. So there is this phenomenon, very interesting and important for our purposes, where Prakrit loan words borrowed into Sanskrit. So in other words, we usually think of Sanskrit going to Prakrit, as in the examples I said before. Sanskrit karma gives Prakrit kamma, not the other way around. But there's a further dimension to that, which is sometimes words bounce back to from Prakrit into Sanskrit. And this is very well attested. So a good example is Sanskrit vikrita, which means kind of deformed, changed, abnormal, becomes Prakrit vikata, that's the normal sound change. Sanskrit vowel ri, or ru, however you say it, disappears in Prakrit, but it leaves as a remnant, usually a following consonant, a following dental, dantya becomes a murdanya or retroflex. So Sanskrit vikrita, Prakrit vikata, no problem. But there is also a Sanskrit word, vikata, which means enormous, and that is clearly from its form a Prakrit word, and it's simply the Prakrit word vikata borrowed back into Sanskrit with as kind of a doublet between vikrita and vikata, which are really historically the same words, and they are semantically differentiated, which is a typical development in situations like that in many languages. When you have dialect doublets, they develop separate meanings or applications, like in English, shirt and skirt, which are historically dialect variants, but come to be represent different kinds of garment. Another interesting example is Sanskrit Prakrita, which means a number of things, but I just translate as at hand, becomes Prakrit Pakata, and this is not, form is not exactly attested. I've marked it here as reconstructed or theoretical, but it's easily, it follows the patterns, normal patterns. The actual existing forms are later and slightly developed. And that bounces back into Sanskrit as the word prakata, which means evident or clear. So the meaning has changed a little bit, but it's obviously still the same basic word. And what we end up with is this curious hybrid word. And if you look at it, pra is the Sanskrit prefix element. Prakrit is pa, Sanskrit is pra, but the suffix element, or the second part of the word, the root part, is kata, Prakrit, rather than Sanskrit. So my point is this: even in proper Sanskrit, and this is absolutely normal, accepted, correct, classical Sanskrit word, it's in the koshas and everywhere in the dictionaries, but you really have a hybrid word. Although people don't think of it that way, a word within Sanskrit that's really a hybrid word. It's half Sanskrit and half Prakrit. I want to mention there's a Russian Indologist, I don't know how well known she is in India, named Tatyana Elazarenkova. Very good, and she translated the entire Rig Veda into Russian. So she was a major Vedic expert. In 1989, she published a really interesting article, and it's one of these articles that, in my opinion, is much more important than, is much less well known than it should be. It's really an important and interesting article. And the title, translated to English, is traces of Prakrit dialectal basis in the language of the Rig Veda. And so she went all the way on this and went out on a limb, but made a pretty strong, convincing argument about Prakritisms, not just in classical Sanskrit, like the ones that I showed before, but even in the earliest language, in the language of the Rig Veda, that there were a number of parallelisms, I guess you would have said, with Prakrit. And not just in vocabulary, I'm talking about vocabulary because it's the easiest to explain, but also in morphology and in syntax. She pointed out a lot of similarities between Rig Vedic Sanskrit and Prakrit languages. And she pointed out that even within the Rig Veda, you get these doublets like kakubha, meaning peak, and kakuha, meaning lofty, an adjective. And they're obviously, in a sense, the same word. What's happening here is Prakritic deocclusion of aspirates. What that means is aspirate consonants like bha in intervocalic position becoming deoccluded. That means the ba part goes away and the ha part remains, so to speak, in non-technical terms. So kakubha, kakuha. And of course, this deocclusion of aspirates is absolutely what happens all the time in Prakrits, happens systemically. Similarly, you have the word saddha and the word saha. Saha is the word we know from Sanskrit, but this showed the original form, even in the Rig Veda, was saddha, and that was deoccluded, so there became saha. So what she's saying, and what she's argues rather convincingly, is that there, even in the earliest known stage of the Sanskrit language in the Rig Veda, the Prakritisms are already there. And what that all boils down to is a view of Sanskrit, of the relationship of Sanskrit and Prakrit, as something like this. The conventional or traditional view is just a line. Here is Sanskrit and it moves into Prakrit, a linear development, arrow in one direction. But following Alizarenkova and a lot of other linguists, you can think of this as the development of Sanskrit. This is past and this is present, maybe future down here. And here is Prakrit. And we see them, I see them, and some Indologists I think would agree, as parallel streams. They run side by side throughout history. So I've made Prakrit go back to the beginning of Sanskrit. It's a little unconventional, but again, I would say I'll recommend you to that article about Lazarenkova. It's translated into English, and it's pretty convincing. And so they are developing in parallel throughout history with relationship. And Sanskrit is the donor to Prakrit, and they give these thick lines, but Prakrit gives some back to Sanskrit with these thin lines. The idea of Sanskrit and Prakrit interacting constantly, well, it's not real. I think it's not really so strange. I mean, if you read what's called the Sanskrit drama, Nataka, it's not really Sanskrit drama. It's in most cases it's Sanskrit and Prakrit drama. And you have people speaking Sanskrit speakers speaking Sanskrit, and they're speaking to Prakrit speakers speaking Prakrit, and they both understand each other perfectly well. There's no problem except maybe the occasional dialect joke. But the point is, you just have to open your eyes to that feature of classical Sanskrit literature and see that the sort of thing that I'm talking about in relation to antiquity is going on throughout history, that the languages are working together and living together. So my point is that with that, when you take that big picture view of the relationship between Sanskrit and Prakrit throughout history, and you see them not as two separate things or as one leading into the other, unidirectional, it becomes, if you see them the way I propose to see them as interacting with each other, going with them back and forth, it's not so hard to explain or to understand why we get this seemingly weird mixture of Sanskrit and Prakrit. So that brings me to my final section. Why did they develop and why did they disappear? Another sample of a Northwestern inscription, but I don't have time to go into that. I think when you look at these hybrid dialect texts in inscriptions or in Buddhist texts, what you're seeing is something that looks strange if you're coming from a sort of classical orientation, but what you're actually seeing is the linguistic reality of the times. We all, or most or all of us, were educated according to a kind of normative view where Sanskrit is the archetype of correctness and everything else is in some way derived and secondary. Linguists, modern linguists, never talk about right and wrong. Those are arbitrary and irrelevant judgments, really. Linguists observe and describe and try to explain, but they don't judge as right or wrong. All judgments as to correctness or incorrectness are, in a linguistic sense, are arbitrary, whether they come from your high school, your elementary school teachers who teach you the right way to speak English or Sanskrit or whatever, or from the language academies in European countries, or from the writings of ancient sages, as in the Indian and Sanskrit case. All of these are arbitrary authorities expressing arbitrary rules of correctness. The reality of language, from the point of view of a linguist, or at least the kind of linguist that I pretend to be, is that languages are like untamed animals, or they're like wild children. And they're willful, they change on their own, they do as they please, and you can control them, but you can never completely control an animal or a child. The reality of language is always some change going on under the surface or at the edges. And at some points in history and in some cultural and social contexts, those so-called incorrect or substandard forms come to have a heavier role, a stronger role. And that's what I would say happened in the period of the hybrid dialects in the Indian world. So that's my explanation of how that happened and why it isn't nearly as weird as it seems to have these mixed dialects at a period when there are differing standards and a lot of social and historical changes going on. But then it remains to be explained, why did these hybrid dialects go away? And that's a complicated term, a complicated question. But it's clear that within the later period of this transitional phase, in the 2nd and 3rd century, the tide turns towards Sanskrit, and both in terms of Sanskrit, more inscriptions in standard Sanskrit, and even the hybrid inscriptions tend to get more closer to Sanskrit. The document that's often or always cited in reference to these kind of questions is this one that I showed you at the beginning, the inscription of King Rudra II, 150 CE. So we're still in the transitional period, but we're moving towards Sanskrit. And this is the first really long, ornate, classical style Sanskrit inscription. And there's a bit of a paradox there. Because who was King Rudra? He was the greatest king of the dynasty called the Western Kshatrapas or Western satraps, ruling in Gujarat, where this stone was found, very influential in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era. And he was the greatest of kings. But who was he really? Well, he has a nice Indian sounding name, Rudra Daman. Yeah, sounds all right. He writes nice Sanskrit. But he wasn't, in some sense, he wasn't really an Indian. His father was a guy called Chashtana. And what kind of name is Chashtana? It sounds sort of like an Indian name, but it's really not an Indian name. And his grandfather was a guy called Zamotika, who was definitely not an Indian. Well, if you know what was going on in the history of North India at this time, they were just one of these, or the last member of these people coming from somewhere in Central Asia, we call them Sakas or Scythians, who came in and established kingdoms in various parts of North and Central India. So it's often said that why would it, that it's kind of another paradox, it's not the grand paradox, it's the little paradox of Indian epigraphy, is that the king who really established Sanskrit, high classical formal kavya style, prose kavya, gadya kavya, in Indian epigraphy was this guy who wasn't even really an Indian. And the theory is that, or it's often proposed, that it's precisely because he wasn't a real Indian and he wanted to sound like a real Indian and, so to speak, seem more Indian than the Indians and go for the elite formal language, and that he uses as a kind of propaganda tool. And I remind you, this is right next to, literally next to the Prakrit inscriptions of Ashoka. So it seems as if he was kind of trying to associate himself politically with Ashoka, the great model of an Indian emperor. Well, that may be the answer or part of the answer. Excuse me for a minute. May have been at least a factor in the movement towards Sanskrit. Another factor that I tend to think about, a lot of this hybrid language was associated with the Buddhists. It was not unique to the Buddhists. In fact, there are a lot of Jaina inscriptions from Mathura in a hybrid language, and there are some Brahmanical or Hindu inscriptions in hybrid language. But the Buddhist component is definitely dominant in this whole linguistic phenomenon. And if you look at the Buddhist Vinayas, and you look at a lot of Vinayas talks about, present rules, and it tells you why those rules were established. And so many of them, there's a very common pattern, there's kind of what I call the Buddhist inferiority complex, if I'm okay to use that term. A lot of rules which are concerning what people outside would think about, concerned with public impressions. Sometimes the monk comes to the Buddha and says, we act in such and such a way, and the people are talking about it, and they think we're acting badly, and the Buddha says, okay, well, I forbid that kind of activity. So there's a lot of sensitivity and even a sense of anxiety or inferiority among the Buddhists about public opinion. And I strongly suspect that that was manifested linguistically, say that people would criticize them for using this hybrid dialect, that's neither Sanskrit nor Prakrit. And there would be a sort of social pressure to the Buddhists towards using more formal Sanskrit language. I mean, throughout, and I never didn't mean to ever question, I mean, Sanskrit always has been the high status language, even when it was used in limited circumstances. And to us, that seems perfectly natural. I would say, like all history, linguistic history is written by the winners, and Sanskrit won out. Its laws remained and became even more strongly as years went by the definitive authoritative language of high status. So it seems natural to think that it always was that way. But in fact, what I'm trying to argue in this presentation, in fact, what it was that in fact there was much more going on, and that Sanskrit was in a complex relationship with the vernacular languages, the contemporary vernaculars, that is what we call the Prakrits, and gradually the power, the strength turned more to Sanskrit, so that we get the impression that Sanskrit was always on top of and separated from Prakrit. But in fact, when you look at these inscriptions and other documents, Buddhist literature, you find that there was actually a lot more going on, and the mixed dialects in particular reveal a whole another stratum of the linguistic history of India. And I think I've talked long enough, so I'll stop there, but I'll be happy to address questions if anything comes to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Salomon, and particularly what you stated towards the end, that there is perhaps much richer history and complexity to understand the relation between Prakrit and Sanskrit, and perhaps we have much more to work on this area, perhaps to unravel how things would have happened then. But before I open the floor for discussion and take a few questions, and I realize that it is nighttime there, so I wouldn't want to keep you awake for long. So perhaps we'll just take a few questions as it would be convenient for you, and we will stop at that. But before we open, may I request Madhavji to perhaps make a few brief comments, if you would like to, on the talk.
It was a very beautiful talk, and on many points, Rich and I have been in agreement for a long time. While he was talking about how Vikruta and Vikata re-entered Sanskrit, but there are some examples that have always come to my mind, and I've been teaching Sanskrit for so long, that in what we consider standard Sanskrit paradigms, so we have Mahyam as a dative for Asmad, but Tubhyam for Yushmat. So here we have Mahyam and Tubhyam, and they don't match linguistically, because if you look at Prakrit, we have Mahyam and Tuhyam in Pali, and suddenly we come to Sanskrit and we have Tubhyam has survived, but here we don't have Mabhyam, we have Mahyam. And so even within sort of very standard Sanskrit paradigms, this uneven relationship of Sanskrit and Prakrit has entered, and maybe Rich would like to say something about.
Yeah, that's an excellent example. It's interesting that it happens in the personal pronouns in the Mahyam, Tuhyam, which the personal pronouns in Sanskrit and in Indo-European languages typically have this really complicated, confusing patterns of development. But the fact that in that very basic component of the language right there, and I think because it's so basic that people don't think about it. And frankly, I didn't think about it until you just said it, but it's a beautiful example of the kind of things that we've been both talking about.
Right. Thank you, Madhurji. And we will now choose out a few questions and also perhaps request those people to come over and introduce themselves. So may I first request Niharika and Meera to call out the people and call out the question and call out the names of the people so that they can come out. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful lecture. I also see your hand raised, but we'll go to the chat box questions and we'll simultaneously take up the other questions. The first question that I'm reading out is by Arnab Bhattacharya. I think the dialectical marks are missing, so I'm sorry if I pronounce a word here and there wrong. If Prakrit from Pakat is not attested, then it is possible that Sanskrit Prakat directly changed to Sanskrit Prakat without any Prakrit intermediary. So I'm just going to request to Arnab to please speak out your question if I said it wrong. And please briefly introduce yourself.
So thank you. I am Arnab. I am in IIT Kanpur. I actually teach computer science. So the question, you are right. So the point is, if this Prakrit form, Pakata, is not attested, and then Sanskrit Prakrita changes, can it change directly to Sanskrit Prakata without the need to go through a Prakrit intermediary form?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I frankly simplified a little bit to make a general point. But the reason I had that intermediate term with asterisk is it doesn't occur in what we usually mean when they talk about Prakrit, but I think it does occur in Pali. And not, and Pali is Prakrit, although it's usually labeled under a separate name. So I think I have a little more support for that, but it's conceivable also that change. I mean, you could just take out that middle part of my diagram that I think you're questioning, just say Prakrita became Prakata, and that would still make the point that I'm trying to make, which is that you have Prakritism within Sanskrit.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Before we go ahead, I just want to know how much time would you be able to give us for the discussion, Professor Salomon? And accordingly, we will just read out the questions and perhaps request you to select a few from them and respond. So, but I would really like to know your convenience, because I know that it's not a pleasant morning time there, like here in Bangalore.
Well, let's see, it's 9:20 p.m. here, so maybe another 20 minutes or so.
Sure, we'll keep that in mind. We will wind up, we will have the discussion for 15 minutes. So what we will do is perhaps we will read more questions. So may I request Meera to read the question, and then if the person wishes, they can just introduce, but not add to the question, because that takes again more time. So Meera can read the question and call out the person to self-introduce, because I think it's important to know who are the people here, because we are only seeing inscriptions here, but not the faces. But I think we didn't mean that only inscription should be shown, but faces also can be shown, if your bandwidth is okay. Yes, Meera, please.
Sure. So the next question is from Sunil Kumar. He asks, what was the impact of the numerous invasions of India? The reference to prevalence of Sanskrit, Prakrit, etc. all. So, Mr. Sunil, so if you're here, may we request you to briefly introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, Sunil, basically I'm a postgraduate in international journalism from Westminster. Currently, I have a digital marketing and online media business. So essentially, you've read out my question. So I think
thank you.
We
just wanted to know who the person is. So,
actually, I didn't hear the question very clearly. So if you could restate it, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, my question was, what was the impact of the numerous invasions of India on the prevalence of, say, Sanskrit and Prakrit, as in the dynasties succeeding Maurya, Shakas, then the Gupta era, so then the numerous Islamic invasions of India. So basically in historical research, did all the impact of all of those invasions might have meant a loss of, say, accurate sources for research. So what I wanted to know was how accurate is our current picture?
Well,
of, how the...
I think I lost the end of the question, but I got most of it.
Yeah, so how prevalent were Sanskrit and Prakrit in different parts of the...
So what we will do is, given that we have only 15 minutes, I don't think we want to trouble this long question, Professor Salomon, with long questions. Let us be more empathic. So what we'll do is, we have the practice of curating the questions and giving the speaker his convenient time to respond to it. So we will take the questions because we want to know who the people are here listening to these lectures and how passionate are they. So thank you, Mr. Sunil Kumar. And I want to read out a question from Jan Juris. Have there been Ashoka inscriptions in Old Greek as well? If you are there, would you like to self-introduce yourself? Okay, I don't see her. That's fine. And at this point, we will just read out the questions. And at the end, perhaps if there is time, we will request Professor Salomon to respond. Otherwise, we will have this responded according to his convenient time in the document which we are curating. I don't see the name of Madam. Your hand is raised, but it's written iPad. So I don't know what's your name. Can you please announce your name and briefly share your question?
Yeah, very brief. Sorry about that. I'm traveling, so I don't have my name on that. I'm Aloka Parashar Sen. Used Professor Solomon's work exhaustively for my thesis on, I worked on the study of the Indian attitudes towards foreigners, militias. So my question to Professor Salomon is that in the Northwest, there are innumerable Kharoshti and Brahmi inscriptions all along the Karakoram highway. And similarly, along the western coast of India, that is the Buddhist cave inscriptions. So my question is, do you think that these small fragmentary inscriptions that are usually in Prakrit and either in Kharoshti or in Brahmi, whether because Prakrit was a lingua franca, that is why the usage of Prakrit in inscription was more common than Sanskrit. And finally, in South India, for the 1st century AD onwards, we have the Tamil Brahmi inscriptions where the language is Tamil. So I was just thinking, because this is like the people are interacting and therefore they are inscribing. And maybe I'd like his reactions on this aspect. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Well, we have several questions, and we have only 15 minutes. I'm very conscious of that. If possible, you can also just write down that question in the chat box so that we don't lose it and we can curate that question. Niharika, can you call out the next name from what we have collected in the order of their appearance?
Yes, ma'am. The next question is by Chi Gracia. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. Her question is, what determines scholars' distinction between Prakrit proper as opposed to some form of hybrid Sanskrit? Okay, she's also not currently present in the meeting. Moving on.
All right, I think, okay, she's not there. Okay, there's another question from Shankar Rajaraman. Dr. Shankar, if you are there, would you like to share your question?
Yeah,
please don't expect a reply immediately, okay?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for the talk. Wanted to hear your views about the borrowing of words such as Ladaha, Hevakasa, and Rincholi from Prakrit by Sanskrit poets specifically. Do you think that these words convey shades of meaning for which near Sanskrit equivalents don't suffice? I am a postdoc fellow in NIAS working on a translation of Manka's Shrikanta Charitam.
All right. There are a couple of questions. One from Papia Mitra. I'm sure you have been asked this before, but is there any connection to Indus script? Is Papia Mitra here? Okay, we will curate that question and perhaps, yeah, you are there. If you wish to introduce yourself, just introduce yourself. And if there's more to the question, you can share it in the chat box.
I'm Papia Mitra. I'm a teacher in English literature, but I'm interested in this thing. But so that is what I want to know, that, as I said, must be a popular question, but is there any connection with Indus script and the earliest inscriptions that have been found?
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Salomon, would you like to respond to the last question, perhaps from Papia Mitra?
Yeah, and then I'll work back as well as I can.
Only if you have time. Yeah, only if you have time. Otherwise, we can respond to it later in the document.
So last question, I still remember.
Yes, please. That's right.
I consider it unlikely that there's any connection between Indus script and Brahmi script, but I know this is an area of considerable controversy. And so many, I mean, so many people have claimed to decipher the Indus script. None of them I've found particularly convincing. I recently had a conversation about the Finnish scholar Asko Parpola, and he's gotten a lot of attention, but I didn't find his decipherments at all convincing. So it's a big question mark, but I don't see any connection between Indus script and Brahmi, although I know a lot of people feel that there should be or must be, but there is this period of really more than 1,000 years in which apparently writing had disappeared and then was reinvented. So that brings into the question, well, then what is Brahmi script? And this is another big controversy. Was it in some way borrowed or adapted from other writing systems in the West, Semitic writings, or was it invented in India? Some people will say it was invented by Ashoka, which I think is quite possible. Although recently, and someone else, I think it was Professor Parashar Sen, asked about the Tamil inscriptions. Recently, a couple of archaeologists from Tamil Nadu have argued on archaeological grounds that they have Tamil inscriptions which are pre-Ashokan, even as early as 5th century BC. And I recently reread that article, and I didn't feel totally convinced, but I don't rule it out either. So that's basically why, and I think I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, why I didn't talk about the Indus script. It's a completely different, separate matter, and not directly relevant to what I was talking about. I wouldn't rule out a connection, but I doubt any connection. Is the short answer.
Okay.
Question. Let's see, I'm trying to remember the previous questions. A couple of people talked about the influence of foreign conquerors or invaders or immigrants, influence on the linguistic and I guess the bigger cultural picture in ancient India. Well, I did talk about that a little bit, and I mentioned the very important and interesting example or special case of Rudra II and his great Sanskrit inscription. So in that case, according to the way a lot of historians interpret it, the influence was sort of the opposite of what you might expect. If you might think that invaders would come and disrupt the classical tradition and the linguistic, Sanskrit linguistic tradition, in that case, at least it was the opposite. They adopted it and promoted it. Sanskrit and related languages tend not to absorb a lot of material from other languages. They tend to be protective of their own vocabulary, but you do have a fair number of loan words, borrowings from languages like Greek and the Scythian Iranian languages in classical Sanskrit. In fields like the sciences, in astronomy and astrology and mathematics, you get a fair amount of loan words from Greek and other languages. But the effect has been fairly minor on the whole, I would say, in terms of borrowings. I'm just in my notes. Oh, and someone asked about Ashokan inscriptions in Greek, one of the, I think it's the second question. And that's easy because there's a clear answer. There are several, well, two major examples from Kandahar. Kandahar, of course, is in Afghanistan, but there were discovered first in the 1960s, and subsequently a few more examples of Ashokan inscriptions. Some are in Aramaic, some are in Greek, and some are bilingual, Greek and Aramaic. So that was a unique, like so many other things about Ashoka and his reign, a unique phase in Indian history, and even in world history, I would say, when he really reached out beyond the borders, the cultural borders of India, and used the local languages. The spirit of that, Ashoka was in some sense a Buddhist, and people question, argue what kind of Buddhist he was, but I think you can say he was a Buddhist, and this is the Buddhist principle. The Buddha would said Sakaya Nrittya. You speak to people in their own language. So adopting the local vernacular, and of course that's what Ashoka did in his Indian inscriptions, and now we know that he did that even in inscriptions in parts of his Vijita, his territory conquests that went beyond the Indian linguistic and cultural areas. And then, yeah, please.
Well, we leave it to you if you would wish to respond now. Otherwise, we can, request your convenience later to respond to those questions, because there are more questions which are there. So perhaps we can just read out the questions so everybody gets to know what these questions are, because questions sometimes they themselves are answers. So may I request Niharika and Meera to read out a few questions, and we are not expecting Professor Salomon to respond now, but just to know what these questions people have raised at this point.
Sure, ma'am. Sure, ma'am. So we have one question from Rajagopalan B. He asks, besides Junagadh, did you find or refer any older inscriptions? If so, where and what is your opinion of it spreading down south in Old Kumari Kandam? So there's one question.
Yeah, so I just wanted to reiterate that we will be sending these questions in written format to Professor Salomon. So he would have his leisure and time to read them and think about it and respond. We will be emailing him all these questions as they are asked in the same text. So yes, Meera.
Well, I just want to, the previous question, was he asking about, did he say Sri Lanka? I didn't hear it clearly.
So would you like me to reiterate the question?
Yeah, please.
So he was saying, besides Junagadh, did you find or refer to any older inscriptions? If so, where and what is your opinion of it spreading down south in Old Kumari Kandam?
Yeah, so to again, since we are running out of time, we will only have the questions read out now, and we will be sending these questions by email to Professor Salomon, and he would have his time to respond to them as per his convenience. So perhaps we can quickly read a few more questions, Meera and Niharika, and then we will come towards the conclusion of this program.
So, okay, the next question is from Aravind Sethi. He says, could Professor Salomon say a little more about what was going on and suggest some more reading on this? What I have in mind is that, was there a conflict between Brahmanical religions and Buddhism and Jainism? Which one could infer from linguistics? So he introduces himself as Aravind Sethi, and he's doing research on the Chalukyas of Vatapi.
Okay, thank you, Meera. Niharika, perhaps we can read out a couple of more questions and then come towards the conclusion of this program.
Yes, ma'am. Another question is by Vijay, and he's asking, Ashoka pillar inscription, is it Prakrit, and the year is it 1869? We knew Sanskrit came from Lord Shiva in the form of Maheshwara Sutra, and therefore we would like to know the period of Sanskrit in its Andi, isn't it? So he has multiple questions curated in one. So yeah. And another question is by Mr. Sundar. He's asking, could one explanation be the movement of at least some members of the Brahmins and priestly class to areas of north of the subcontinent into Central Asia in response to delusion of their power? and taking Sanskrit along with them, with Sanskrit becoming the language of Central Asia, etc., and then Sanskrit becoming once again after the central figure after invasions.
Interesting question. I wish I had time to.
Yeah, please, Professor Salomon, if you wish to respond to this.
Well,
Any
yeah,
of the questions. Yes, please.
I'll just quickly respond to that because it ties in with something I was going to say but didn't have time.
Sure.
I said one of why we don't have evidence of actual Sanskrit documents from India of any great antiquity, and it's obviously because of climatic factors. But as I think the questioner is alluding to, that we actually do have ancient manuscripts and very old manuscripts in Sanskrit going back almost 2,000 years, but none of them are from India. They're all from outside of India and mostly from Central Asia. And I had the good fortune to visit that part of Central Asia, part of China now, a couple of times in years past, and seen the places where they found these literally thousands of Buddhist Sanskrit manuscripts, mostly fragmentary. You really see, there you see what the manuscript culture of India was like, even though it only survives outside of India. So it's a fantastic resource for showing us what the manuscript culture and Sanskrit culture was like in India, even though we don't have the documents there in India proper.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Niharika, would that conclude our questions at this point?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so it was yet another absolutely beautiful morning for many of us in India. I mean, almost all of us in India, and some of you in other parts of the country, perhaps a beautiful night listening to Professor Salomon. And from the questions, we can see that the number of issues which come up perhaps is not going to be so easy to be unraveled or explained, given the antiquity and the richness which is embedded in the antiquity. And so I think we are coming towards the conclusion of today's lecture. Professor Madhurji, you want to say something, or should we move towards the conclusion?
You can move toward the conclusion.
Okay. All right. Okay. So, Professor Richard, would you like to say something more, or shall we move towards the conclusion?
Well, no, I just want to thank you all for giving me this opportunity, and thank Madhav for sort of blazing a trail that I followed along over many years. And thank you for all your questions. I'm sorry it wasn't time to answer all of the questions, but it's getting to be bedtime for Madhav and me.
That's right. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Richard. And once again, I wish to remind you that we work at the back end too, curating these questions. And because the questions themselves are very important and their answers as well, we are curating all the questions and we are sharing these questions with all the speakers. And it is the same link which we have sent to you. And we would have the answers to these questions as per the convenience of the speaker. So thanks again to Sir Richard Salomon on my personal behalf and behalf of this Institute, National Institute of Advanced Studies. But may I request Niharika Sharma for a formal vote of thanks and also to tell us what is coming next week.
Thank you so much, ma'am. My sincere gratitude to Professor Richard Salomon, who presented such a flawless and elusive lecture at an odd hour, sitting there in the US, it's night. For us, it was nectar in the morning, but I can understand how difficult it was to stay up and still give such a profound lecture. So thank you so much, sir, for the information and, the way that you presented such a difficult topic. Thank you so much, Sangeeta ma'am and Professor Madhav for, bringing this idea together and also giving us this platform to meet such eminent scholars and listen to them and understand the very beautiful language of Sanskrit. So my sincere thanks to Professor Sangeeta Menon and Professor Madhav. I would also thank my team for always being there, working at the back end and also throughout the sessions. Ashwini, Abhishek, Meera, and Preet, who is not with us today, but is still working at the back end for us. So thank you, everyone. For the upcoming lecture, we have a lecture by Professor Dominic Vujasic. His lecture is on healing the mind and the body, the history of Ayurveda. The lecture is on 17th March 2021. The lecture will start at 9 a.m. That's the Indian time, and 16th March 8:30 p.m. MST. So thank you everyone for your presence and for all the questions and for your active participation. We'll see you next Wednesday with another wonderful talk and an eminent scholar. So namaskar everyone. Thank you for your presence.
Okay, thank you. Good night. Good morning.
Thank you.
Good night.